Hey everybody, it's Party Elite, and today we're taking a look at the newly announced DLC for Crusader Kings 3, Royal Court. There are a lot of interesting changes coming with this DLC, and it's paired with a free update, and as we'd sort of guessed, this one is less focused on a particular area or people, like the Northern Lords flavor pack, and is instead going for a larger scale set of changes that apply across the board, like a full-fledged expansion. It touches on a bunch of really interesting elements that I cannot wait to explore, so if you want more coverage on the lead up to and after release, make sure to subscribe, because you're guaranteed to see some here. With all that said and done, let's take a look at 6 major changes coming with Royal Court. The Royal Court. The first big change to discuss is also the namesake of the DLC, and the root of many of the other changes we'll be discussing as well. Characters who have attained the rank of King or Emperor, or their cultural equivalents around the world, will have access to and responsibility over their royal court, in an attempt to add not just more role-playing, but another set of fresh challenges. Once one has ascended to the higher ranks, the royal court will bring with it a plethora of new ways to interact with all who hold rank and title in your realm. The space itself will be one that you can visit in full-fledged 3D, though from my understanding it will be locked camera angles only. There are 4 visually distinct, customizable styles for 4 different culture groups, and I suspect that we might see these evolve over the life of the game as more flavor packs release, but that's not a certainty, just something that would be nice to have. Now within the room, you'll see various family members, vassals, members of your court, and others, all of whom you can interact with, and the room itself is a representation of your status. The more appealing your court is, the more likely you are to get particularly interesting guests making their way over to it. From the sounds of it, the people of your realm will at times seek an audience with you, bringing you their troubles, but there's also the ability to hold court, presumably a decision that comes with a cost and a cooldown, and I would assume that it can help or hurt you in various ways, depending on how things play out. Holding court will have folk from across your realm come to your court, and I wouldn't be surprised if this is visualized similar to how feasts are in the current game, where you can see all those who came to court and all those who didn't. I don't think it's necessarily a reflection of who likes you or not, but a reflection of who might have grievances, might be coming for shenanigans, or might be busy elsewhere. Be that as it may, you'll be responsible for dealing with the various grievances brought before you, picking sides in disputes, and likely improving or damaging your relations with the relevant people. I'd be curious to see what kinds of things you'll have petitioned. Will people try to steal court positions, arguing their case before you? Will vassals ask for more lands and titles? How important will hooks be in these events? Will friendships and rivalries form? Again, I'll be curious to see how these events play out, especially when you're on the receiving end of an invitation. As a count or a duke, will the player be able to attend their liege's court to air their own grievances? I don't think they've mentioned anything about that, so I suppose time will tell. I suspect that prestige will certainly come into play with at least some of the decisions you make as a king or emperor, either the expense of it to enforce your authority, or the earning of it when all is said and done. And again, I wonder what comes into play if you're the vassal in the situation, not the liege. Speculation aside, something you will be acquiring when holding court is Grandeur, a brand new stat to track, and our next topic of focus. Grandeur. Tied directly to the royal court is the concept of grandeur, a measure of how impressive your court is considered to be as determined by, for lack of a better way of putting it, what you've done with the place. Are the walls adorned with great paintings and tapestries? Are there amazing sculptures atop plinths on display? Or perhaps you've acquired some particularly fascinating weapons? How did your last session of holding court go? Do you have amenities for your courtier and guests? Grandeur is a number you can use to fuel your pride or your ambition, not only for the sake of your ego, but also for the sake of what others think about you. As a king or emperor of a realm, depending on the strength and size of said realm, the world will expect your royal court to meet certain standards of grandeur. Fail to meet these expectations and expect to face diplomatic penalties, presumably with folk inside and outside your realm. You might be king in your court, but a mere jester in the court of public opinion. Have a grandeur that's higher than what's expected of you, however, and you'll see some benefits, including visits from more intriguing guests as mentioned earlier. This becomes another layer of challenge for players as they reach these higher ranks, and Grandeur will always trend towards a baseline number that is determined by the various steps you've taken to make your court particularly, well, grand. Think of it like dread, where your character's dread always trends towards their natural dread. The methods for increasing your grandeur often, if not always, cost some amount of wealth, and as your realm grows, you'll need to invest more and more of it in order to meet the growing expectations. The plan is to use grandeur as a method of preventing blobbing and rapid expansion. If that's the case, I sincerely hope having low grandeur causes some serious trouble and can't easily be ignored like being over your domain limit once was. I can imagine vassals not respecting your authority, and I can imagine allies not wanting to be seen rubbing shoulders with the lacking, and I can also imagine factions that oppose you should you be deemed unfit to rule, but we'll see how it all plays out. A damage to opinion from low grandeur works nicely with clan governments as they stand already, as it directly impacts the contribution to taxes and levies from your vassals, but I do hope it goes beyond that, instigating more roleplay related events and drama. But on the topic of improving grandeur, we broach the topic of artifacts, items, weapons. I'm glad the personal inventory didn't take long to bring over from Crusader Kings 2. There's an undeniable cool factor to owning stuff that has a story in the setting, and that feeling is exactly what the various artifacts intend to enable. There are a couple of ways to acquire said artifacts. The most common will be through patronage. As mentioned previously, a grand court brings with it more and more interesting guests, and at times, you'll receive what's called an inspired guest. These are guests that have a project in mind, but lack the funds to pursue them. If you choose to patronize them or to become their patron, they'll get to work on their projects for you. Artists, craftsmen, thinkers, smiths, jewelers, scholars, adventurers, they all have their own approach and will all go about bringing you artifacts in various ways, or perhaps not, because apparently, at least some of them will be con artists, looking for that easy money from a king or emperor dumb enough to trust them. I really hope there are options to chase down and punish such charlatans, because it sounds like there's plenty of action involved around the items you do get when you're not being conned. I imagine funding certain projects will be similar to commissioning a great epic. While you might not be consulted in the middle of an adventurer's hunt for a famed artifact, and while a smith or artist might have their own vision, I imagine they'll occasionally come to you asking you to add to the initial investment, depending on the likelihood of success that you'd like to see. And items can either be carried on your person or stored in the royal court to increase its grandeur. No matter what you decide to do, both lead our conversation to the other method of acquiring artifacts: the spoils of war. Presumably, when a holding where the royal court is situated is captured through a siege, the besieging army will be able to plunder said court and steal artifacts similar to how they are able to capture prisoners. And if the items are being carried by an individual, they might be taken off their corpse or stolen should said person get captured in battle. There are entire schemes and intrigue mechanics planned around the acquisition and reacquisition of these items, and there are even plans for claim systems for some of these items, particularly weapons, allowing you to go to war for a particularly important or beloved item, or perhaps duel for it instead. I'm extremely curious to see all this in action, and I'm also curious about the idea of claims over an item. I understand having a claim over an item that was stolen from you, but how will the inheritance of items work? Will sons and daughters fight over their parents' portraits and swords? Some of these items will have history to them, much like lands and titles have their history tracked, and weapons in particular will have a plethora of details assigned to them when they are forged, with the details depending on the skill level of the smith and the investment level of the patron. And the role player in me can absolutely see myself getting attached to these items, whether inherited or made specifically for me. Will I butcher an entire countryside to get back my favorite dagger? Why don't you steal it from me and find out? Now, some artifacts will decay over time, and you'll have the option to commission their repair or store them as heirlooms, though the latter will require an antiquarian at your court. Wondering what that is? Well, let's talk about minor titles and roles. Master of Horse, Keeper of Swans, Cupbearer, etc., etc. All these minor titles were just an easy way to improve somebody's opinion of you in Crusader Kings 2, sometimes with a minor cost in salary. With Crusader Kings 3, the reintroduction of these will include an increase in their importance. Just like the aforementioned Antiquarian is a must-have for preserving heirlooms, champions will fight your duels, food tasters will help you dodge assassination attempts, and tutors will teach you languages to help you better get along with your foreign-tongued counterparts. And that's just scratching the surface of these minor titles and roles. Now, even the more superfluous minor titles and roles have actual responsibilities and salaries, and skill levels will impact the efficiency of these people as well. Like your court physician, whose learning skill literally makes a difference between life or death, your champion will likely need a decent prowess. Oh, and for a good time, you'll want to appoint a court jester. Have a landed person fill the role to anger them, or give an unlanded person the honor of performing for you and make them happy. I find the court jester to be particularly interesting because of that duality. It implies that there are twists and turns to each appointment, and each of these characters will also be coming into play during various events and decisions too. So I'm really curious to see how this all plays out, how the minor title and minor roles sort of intercept, interfere, or assist you when you're trying to deal with your realm as a whole. Now, we briefly touched on some of the roles because we don't yet know too much about them, but the court tutor ties into a bigger conversation. One about language. The culture you're born into determines the language you naturally speak and know, but to learn another language, you'll need to work with other people. Between schemes, lifestyle perks, and opinions, there's room for shenanigans. Somebody who doesn't like you might intentionally mislead you in your education, and I imagine that'll lead to a few awkward moments. We don't know too much about the learning system here, but I wonder how it works with guardians. Surely a 6-year-old who is sent off to a different country and culture doesn't really retain their original tongue, especially if you request the cultural conversion. But what if you send them when they're in their teens? Can you have multilingual children? Either way, I'm sure we can expect some fun events for the students and the teachers, whether they're children or adults at the time of teaching. Improved language skills will help a character get along with other people who speak said language. Being able to speak a people's language will get them to like you more if you're good at it, which is not what happens in Quebec, but it does reflect my experience in visiting France. Now, I imagine this will have an impact in public opinion from lands of the targeted culture, and it will have an impact on diplomacy between specific characters too. In fact, not pursuing a potential linguistic connection will now have a negative impact rather than a neutral zero impact on interactions, so you're actually encouraged to learn new languages accordingly. It's important to keep in mind that the learning skill of the teacher and student determines how easily a language is learned, and that learning subsequent languages gets harder and harder, so becoming a polyglot is possible, but it's not easy. Some flavorful options are also available for the AI to pursue, especially if they have high learning. An example out there is Catholic priests who try to learn Latin. I'm curious how much of an impact all this will have, and I'm also curious if learning specific languages will come with interesting or curious negatives. Imagine, for example, a Spanish prince who speaks Arabic. Will they be shunned by Christians for buddying up with the enemy? Will it make Arabic speakers more willing to ally with them? Will cultures transcend their divisions? Well, a cultural overhaul. Ethos, pillars, tradition, acceptance. Culture is changing. Always has been, always will be, and now the same can be said about Crusader Kings 3 as well. I'll split this section into two because a big part of this overhaul is coming as a free update, which is what I'll talk about first, and then we'll discuss the part that's exclusive to the DLC in the next section. Cultures will no longer be immutable, but they will have core elements that drive them. Ethos will determine the very heart of a culture. Are you a bellicose people? A spiritual people? An incestuous people? This will be huge in determining the decisions people of this culture make in keeping with its pillars, while taking advantage of its traditions. Pillars determine things like names, clothing styles, architectural styles, the accepted chains of command. You could say they are the open display of culture. If you look upon a person or a city of a culture, how can you determine their tribe before they even begin to speak? The traditions, meanwhile, bestow advantages to a people. Do your people have a tradition of raiding? Get a boost to that. A tradition of farming in certain conditions? Get a buff when doing so. A traditional method of determining inheritance. Traditions can be acquired, traditions can be forsaken. And the ease of this process is determined by the ethos. A bellicose people might not be willing to take on the tradition of, say, forming drum circles and singing Kumbaya as easily as they'd be willing to take on the tradition of flaying their enemies, just by way of example. Both of these examples, by the way, are just made up. I don't think either of them are actually in the game or anything. Either way, a culture will end up with lots of traditions, with 2 to 6 slots over time that can be fleshed out by the culture head, slowly filling in slots at the cost of prestige, like forming a new religion at the cost of piety, but with a bit more of a slow, transitional approach to it, I suppose. And again, while some traditions are cheaper or easier to acquire, others are more expensive or tougher based on your people's ethos, and other traditions will actually be exorbitantly overpriced unless you meet certain prerequisites. You can't expect to have a tradition of harnessing the desert if you don't hold any desert lands, and you can hardly expect to have the tradition of riding an elephant to your wedding when you're just chilling up in Iceland. The way cultures see each other is also evolving. Cultural acceptance is how willing different cultures are to get along based on their similarities as well as events. A long, shared, peaceful border between two people might increase the cultural acceptance between them, but if there's a constant state of war between a people, cultural acceptance between them will drop. This cultural acceptance value is shared on both sides. One side doesn't have a higher or lower acceptance of the other. It's the same number, and it will impact the culture opinion penalty. So, for example, a 50% cultural acceptance will turn a -30 opinion modifier to -15. Acceptance does not trend upwards, but instead you have to work towards its increase. But when it drops, it won't drop below its baseline number either. So as you can see, cultures are getting a huge overhaul in the free patch that comes with the DLC. Again, without spending a penny, you'll be getting all of these culture updates that I talked about in this section. But the DLC itself will take things a step further with the introduction of hybridization and divergence. This topic in particular fascinates me, and I'm really excited to see it represented in Crusader Kings 3. Just like culture isn't static, it also doesn't evolve in isolation. It's influenced by outside factors and other people. Cultures can change based on locale, its practitioners, and more. Think, for example, about the Normans, a Franco-Norse hybrid. As things stand now, if you rule over a land that belongs to a different culture, you can either adopt their culture or convert them to yours. With the DLC, using a court action, you can begin the hybridization of your two cultures, forming a blended culture where you choose the ethos, pillars, and traditions like you were forming a new religion. This might give you opportunities to acquire traditions that might otherwise have been prohibitively expensive. From my understanding and using our aforementioned example, while the French may never have set foot on the desert outside of one small holding, a Franco-Hausa people might have an intimate understanding of the deserts and how to best fight on or harness them. The AI will also be looking to hybridize cultures, so you can expect to see some interesting results, making for a renewed experience when revisiting old playthrough locations. Cultural divergence, meanwhile, is a way to step away from your people's current ways. A tool available whether you're the culture head or not, cultural divergence will allow you to replace your traditions with new ones that are better suited for your circumstances at the cost of prestige, just like hybridization that costs prestige as well. A cultural divergence by a powerful enough liege can see their vassals follow suit, converting to the new culture as well. And this is just another way to add more flavor to a game of Crusader Kings 3. This is all very fascinating stuff to me. Again, like I said earlier, the idea of hybridization and divergence of cultures through history is something that always piques my interest when you take into consideration as well migration patterns and interconnected parts of the world. This stuff really just blows my mind. So it's cool to see Crusader Kings 3 trying to tackle it, and I'm really excited to see what naturally happens among the AI when it's just kind of doing its thing. And I'm also curious to see what players will be able to pull off. This is really interesting to me, and I'm curious to see all the stories and all the new hybrid cultures that come out of this sort of set of mechanics. Now, though there's no release date announced for the Royal Court DLC yet, I suspect we'll be seeing quite a few dev diaries highlighting all of these features and more, and I'm certainly going to be keeping an eye on all of it. So you can expect me to cover it on the channel as soon as possible as well. If you are interested in keeping up with this DLC as well, make sure you subscribe for more Crusader Kings 3 content in general. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this DLC and everything that comes with it. Let me know what you think down below, and any plans you're making in your head already for stories to craft. They're always a good bit of fun to read. I do read all the comments, and I'm always particularly interested in people's kind of stories and plans for games like Crusader Kings 3. So share away, because I'm curious, and I've got some plans for myself as well for whatever my next playthrough will be when this DLC drops. But that's all for now, folks. As always, a massive thanks goes out to all of the channel members and patrons who've been supporting the channel on a monthly basis. Y'all keep us alive and running smoothly. And of course, a big ol' thanks goes out to each and every one of you for watching. Until next time, cheers.